I can imagine that the sun is intelligent and an organism, but only if I imagine it exists on that scale in some way that's fairly hard to relate to. In other words, it's like the Pacific Ocean. I can imagine it to be intelligent, but I would imagine that its intelligence is of such a nature that it and I probably don't have too much to do with each other. Meanwhile, out in the universe, somewhere, these entities exist which we do contact in the psychedelic experience. I've always sort of imagined, well, I'm never sure. I mean, are they creatures of other levels or simply other places? And then if other places, they seem to be places so far away that the laws of physics are different. So it's not just like the difference between Chicago and Memphis. It's like the difference between Chicago and Oz. You know, there's an ontological thing going on of incommensurability. Sometimes I think that perhaps, you know, we've talked about how the morphogenetic field is a necessary hypothesis, but hard to detect the way you can detect an electromagnetic field. Well, then the creative response to that is to say, well, perhaps the imagination is the detection of the morphogenetic field, that the imagination is somehow that the mind, the brain-mind system is a quantum mechanically delicate enough chemical system that incoming input from the morphogenetic field can push these cascades of chemical activity one way or another, and that in the act of daydreaming or psychedelic tripping or something, you're actually scanning the morphogenetic field. Well, in that case, it means that what we call the imagination is actually the universal library of what is real, that you couldn't imagine it if it weren't real somewhere, sometime. And in that to me is very empowering, because I think that's the truth that you learn at the center of the psychedelic experience that's so mind-boggling that you can't really return to it with it, that it's real. And if thinking about the heavens in this way as organic, integrated, and animate makes that more probable, then I'm all for it. I think Rupert, you and I, and perhaps to some degree Ralph, come out of the influence of the school called organismic philosophy that Alfred North Whitehead and Joseph Needham and L.L. White put forth. Clearly, the reason that organism, you know, Rupert made the very eloquent case for organismic organization at every level. Clearly, the reason that's been unwelcome in science is because it raises questions about the signal systems which hold these organisms together. And that is pointing back toward a theme that I know is dear to Rupert. He touched on it this evening, which is the systematic elimination of spirit from any explanation of what nature is. I mean, a machine communicates mechanical force through direct contact, basically. An organism operates through chemical systems of diffusion or color signal or even language in some cases. So it's these higher order forms of function, if called down to explain large chunks of nature, that begin to look like a reinfusion of spirit into nature. Strangely enough, this is, of course, exactly what we need, but orthodoxy is fighting, tooth and nail, This is because it's still reacting to the 19th century battle where deism had such power that it appeared potentially capable of frustrating Darwinian rationalism. But that battle was won long ago. Now it's time to realize that trying to reason upward from the laws of atomic physics to organisms is not going to work. That there are what David Bohm and other people, I suppose, called emergent properties at every level. There's nothing magical about that concept. I mean, think of one molecule of water. It's absurd to call it wet. You know, wetness is something that you have when you have millions of molecules of water. It's an emergent property that comes out of millions of molecules of water. And at every level in the evolution of physical complexity, complexity itself has permitted the emergence of new properties with, you know, the iridescence of mind and culture emerging finally at the top of this pyramid. I don't know. I think it's interesting the way the culture has changed its attitude toward the heavens. I mean, a revolution in our thinking that is fairly fundamental is that no one at this point, I think, believes in the human conquest of space. This has gone from a national commitment in the 60s to the chicest thing you could be into in the 70s, on a par with virtual reality and MDMA today, to it isn't mentioned. Not by freaks like us, not by presidential candidates, not by right-wingers, left-wingers, middle-of-the-roaders, or anybody else. It's all over. The heavy lift launch capacity that resided in the Soviet military-industrial complex has been allowed to drift into obsolescence. They held the keys to reaching near Earth orbit, and it's slipping away. So I appreciate your attempt to animate the cosmos, because apparently we're turning into the worm dimension. We're turning away from all that. It has become, like so much, a part of a past era of grandeur and glory, seeming not to be repeated. We held a virtual reality conference here a year and a half ago, and Howard Rheingold had a revelation in the middle of the night down on the platform in front of the big house when he said, "My God, now I understand what virtual reality is for. It's to keep us from ever leaving the Earth." And, it bears consideration. Your talk made me think of Olaf Stapleton's The Star Maker, which is a wonderfully eloquent statement of an animate cosmos, which if you've not read it, it's a very up book.